Jonathan, thank you so much for meeting with us today. Could we start by talking a little bit about your roots in Middle Georgia and your family connections?
Right. No, my parents were both born and raised in Middle Georgia. We talked about before, as it happened, they went off to Pakistan as a missionary family back in the 50s, and so I was born in Pakistan. But we always returned to Middle Georgia. In fact, I had my third grade and eighth grade in public schools in Middle Georgia, at Bruce School in South Macon, at what was had just been the Battle of Hudson in Macon as well. So I've had that, and then I've come back, interned at the Macon Telegraph, worked one summer off in Jones County and the Rural Electrification Authority, doing right-of-ways and stuff like that. And then in the more recent history, in the Foreign Service, I've kept on coming back to Georgia. My family's lived here. My parents have retired here. My sister lives in Macon as well. My brother lives in Atlanta. So even throughout this Foreign Service career, have always kept on coming back to Middle Georgia.
Could you kind of talk a little bit about your career and how it got started? I know you went to Northwestern University.
That's correct. Yeah. No, I was mostly in Pakistan growing up, and then through high school. Came back to Northwestern for university, studied journalism, was interested in international affairs at the time, also interested in Asia, to be honest. After college, worked in Washington for a year, and that kind of maybe directed me more toward international affairs, international economics. And so that's what it turned out I did on my graduate work. Finished graduate school, joined the Foreign Service. In my case, it was the U.S. Agency for International Development, basically the ones that do not only humanitarian assistance, but also health programs, education programs, small business development programs, economic growth programs. And, again, in terms of my career, the years roll on. It was 25 years, but basically serving in that capacity in Pakistan, which I was familiar with, but also in Yemen, in South Africa, Kazakhstan, Jordan, Mongolia, and Cambodia. Have had a Foreign Service career, although, again, in my case, working more on the development side, in the third world countries mostly.
Could you talk a little bit about how the ambassadorship to Mongolia came about? I know that you said that wasn't really part of your career track, but...
Yeah, well, on the aid side, you don't think of that as happening. We mentioned before that I'm in the career track. It's basically every year the State Department puts forward nominations, or it's a process that starts with the State Department. Ultimately, of course, it goes through the White House. Most people have been in the State Department proper, might have been economic officers, political officers, management officers. But in addition, there are other Foreign Service agencies out there, or foreign affairs agencies, including the Foreign Agricultural Service, the Foreign Commercial Service, and in my case, the U.S. Agency for International Development. And from time to time, as part of the career process, those of us that are Foreign Service officers in those specialized agencies are also put forward as ambassadors. Again, that's not what drives you in your career. That's not what you expect. But we're thrilled, and it's a great opportunity. What also doesn't happen too often is to go back to a country where you served previously. And we served 3 years in Mongolia, and to be honest, enjoyed it. Felt we did good work there. As a family, had a good time. And so this opportunity did arise to go back in a different capacity. I think it'll build very much on prior experience that we've had. And prior aid work, but it is a very different role than being an aid officer in a country.
Can you tell our viewers a little bit about Mongolia, about its history and what's happening there now? Right.
Well, it's got a fascinating history. Of course, it goes way back, and I suppose the founding father was Genghis Khan. You're talking about the 13th century there, but basically that's the history they look back on. The more recent history, of course, is different. It was part of the Soviet orbit for decades after the 1920s, but in the late 80s, early 90s, when you had perestroika, you had the opening, and Mongolia did indeed commit to a market economy as well as democracy, and they've made significant progress in more recent years. As a country, of course, it's located between Russia and China. It's a huge country, though a sparsely populated country. In terms of physical size, is actually slightly bigger than Alaska. Another comparison we sometimes say is that you put Mongolia on a map, it would stretch from Washington to Denver. But in terms of population, very small, less than 3 million people. So I think one other very quick example about the size of Mongolia, the first province I ever visited was called South Gobi Province, and it's roughly the size of Bangladesh, roughly the size of Cambodia, In the case of the South Gobi province, Bangladesh has 150, 60 million people. Cambodia has maybe 13 or 14 million people. This entire province had 40,000 people. So the perspective you get is of a large country physically, but actually a small population.
Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to live in Mongolia, the weather, the food?
It's a fascinating country. Again, the history is interesting, the culture is interesting, the music. Its origins are as a nomadic society. Nowadays, probably about 40% of the population lives in Ulaanbaatar. Ulaanbaatar is a product of the 20th century in terms of the buildings, a strong sort of Soviet flavor to it. But more recently, because of the a lot of the money coming in from the mining, has experienced other kinds of growth as well. So there's new buildings and stuff like that. It's got traffic jams. It's got air issues. Even now, about half the population of Ulaanbaatar lives in yurts, or gers as they call them, which are essentially those round tents. And some of it's been movement from the countryside, people coming in. So, you have that one huge urban area, you have the smaller provincial capitals, but indeed many people still live in the countryside and are nomads. The big 5 animals there that they have in terms of domesticated animals are the yaks, the 2 humpback camels, the horses, the sheep, and the goats. The goats are actually a form of income in terms of cashmere. A lot of the best cashmere in the world comes from Mongolia, so that's the more traditional product. And then, as we've discussed in more recent years, it's really mining is very much on the table as a potential source of income and wealth for that country.
What about the weather?
Oh, the weather, yes. Well, Mongolia has the reputation of being the world's coldest capital. I'm not 100% sure if that's true, but it can get down to 40 below. And people say, "Are you talking Celsius or Fahrenheit?" Actually, that's where it crosses. It's the same at 40 below, yeah. But actually, it's actually winter's not as bad as you might expect. It's clear skies most of the time. Ulaanbaatar is the same latitude as Paris, so you don't have those sort of short, damp European kinds of winters. It's more dry, sunshine all the time, sort of blue sky country, if you will. And so it's certainly bearable. And then the summers are actually quite hot. It's one of those sort of landlocked situations where you don't have the modern effect of the ocean, so it can get very hot. Fall, quite frankly, is my favorite time of year. I mean, September would be like New England fall, and it's really quite beautiful in Mongolia at that time.
What kind of food are they known for?
Oh, the food is different. But the traditional diet, if you will, is in the summertime, when it's the time of plenty, you have the white season, as it were, where you have the cheese, the yogurt, the milk, the fermented mare's milk, and it's basically a dairy diet. And then in the wintertime, it's a meat diet, because the animals are threatened by the elements anyway, so you figure you might as well eat them. So that's when you have the mutton and the meat. So traditionally, the fruits and vegetables are almost unknown. The rice is almost unknown. That's changed, obviously, in recent years. The diets are changing. But the traditional Mongolian diet, if you will, or food, is very much based on that on that nomadic economy.
Could you talk about the strategic importance of Mongolia to the U.S.?
Yeah, in terms of where it's situated, I mean, I think it would be more in the context of Asia, that a stable, prosperous Mongolia is a good thing. It's situated between Russia and China. Basically, Mongolia as a country, has its own foreign policy based on the fact they need to have good relations with their neighbors, which by and large they do. But they also have what they call a third neighbor policy. So for them, the relations with China and Russia are very important, but on top of that, they want to have good, productive relations with their third neighbors, which they mean Japan, Korea, Europe, and the United States. And so they value the relationship with the U.S., whether it's a trade relationship, an economic one, a development one. There's some quite large programs there right now in all those areas, and so that's an important part of it. And again, from our perspective, a sovereign, peaceful, prosperous Mongolia is a good thing, and we try to support that.